Protests in Bahrain, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage from the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. The domino metaphor is often applied to Middle Eastern and North African governments currently being rocked by protests. While there are some common elements across countries, a more careful analysis reveals a variety of processes in the region occurring simultaneously, but largely independent of one another. A case in point is Bahrain, where a popular uprising is playing out in the context of several unique factors. A sectarian element pitting minority Sunni leadership against a majority Shia population, armed intervention by a neighboring nation, presence of a major U.S. naval facility, and connection with a larger contest between major powers in the region. For a first-hand analysis of the Bahraini protests, we're joined by a familiar face, IWA Director Rob Ricigliano, who recently traveled to the island nation. Rob, welcome back. Welcome to International Focus.
Thank you.
Well, I wonder if you could start with just a little bit of background on Bahrain generally. And people certainly have seen the name in the news recently, but might not have a good sense of the geography and sort of the history.
Sure. I mean, I think people can see a map of Bahrain, and it's basically one main island. There are actually 30 islands actually that comprise Bahrain. It's about 16 miles off the coast of Saudi Arabia, connected by a causeway, which the forces you mentioned in the intro traveled over and a few weeks ago. It had been a British colony for many, many years. It became independent in the 70s, and interestingly, Iran claimed Bahrain as a part of its territory. So it wasn't. So as it left British rule, it was claimed by Iran, and the UN had a plebiscite, and there was an overwhelming vote for independence of the island. So since then, it's existed as a separate independent nation, although very close to Saudi Arabia in various ways. But certainly the connection between the Sunni leadership, the royal family in Bahrain, and obviously the Sunni leadership, the monarchy in Saudi. So,
talk a little bit about the form of government.
So it's in the Gulf, the 6 Gulf states. Around the Persian Gulf, so Saudi, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, Kuwait. There's United Arab Emirates. They're all ruled by a king or an emir, and it is a very traditional, sort of culturally traditional form of government, where you have an emir, someone who's in charge of everything. It is maybe unfamiliar in some ways to people in the West, because it's not really a dictatorship in the classic strongman that people would be familiar with, say, from sort of the Cold War and the communist states.
Well, and the regimes are very much tied to families, right?
Yeah, it's very family related. It has very deep roots in sort of Arab culture. So they may behave tyrannically at times, because they do have kind of a consolidation of power, or the royal family does. But there's also a tradition of the modulus where people can bring complaints, and it is the incumbent on the monarch to listen to those complaints and address those complaints. It of course has changed over the years as the international system is more developed, as they've discovered oil in the region, and these countries have gotten more plugged into the global economy. But that essentially is a control by a single family, and the Al Khalifa family, which is in control of Bahrain, has been there for over 200 years. They are way back from the same basic clan as the Al Sauds in Saudi Arabia and the Sabbahs in Kuwait. So it's a very long traditional family. It is very tied to clan and tribe, as you mentioned. And it is one of the issues we're seeing now is as these states are becoming more connected to the global economy, Less so states like Saudi, which really has its oil wealth as its sole means of income and what gives it sort of unconditional international support. Then you get countries like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, which are which have some oil, but are moving more into the financial services and are more tied to sort of international public opinion and more susceptible to pressure, I think, from other governments.
So let's jump forward then to the disturbances. Really, what was the chronology of that? I mean, in Tunisia, for example, it was sort of one precipitating factor of this fruit seller who was mistreated, and that sparked the whole thing. Was there some precipitating incident in Bahrain, or is it just part of the zeitgeist of the region?
It began, I think, more as the sort of the zeitgeist of the region, that you had the events in Tunisia and Egypt, and it began sparking protests in Jordan and in Syria and to a very limited extent even in Saudi Arabia. So all across the Arab world, you began to see people taking to the streets, voicing an opinion, believing that this was their moment to achieve perhaps a level of democratic participation that they had not been able to do. So similarly in Bahrain. So in Bahrain you have not just this it's not just a reaction against a royal family, a monarchy. It's also a Sunni Shia issue. So that about estimates are between 30 and 50% of the population is Sunni, which means about 50 to 70% is Shia. And as you know, the tensions between Sunni and Shia throughout the Islamic world are very pronounced also in Bahrain. So the protesters saw this not just as a chance for, I think, greater democratic participation in a monarchy, essentially a monarchy, to also one where it's also sort of almost Shia emancipation, if you will, as well. So you had these two forces really propelling people to take to the streets in Bahrain. The week of February 14th, there are a series of protests that were met with some violent opposition from the police and the security forces. There were not mass casualties from those, like you saw, say, in Yemen or in Libya. But there were 7 people that were killed over that week. And I think in the previous several decades in Bahrain, 40 people had been killed in political protests. So 7 to be killed in 1 week was a very traumatic event, actually, for, I think, most Bahrainis, both Sunni and Shia. That led to this major pulling back. And so, contrary to what happened in a place like Libya, or even in Yemen, the government pulls back the police and the security forces from the street and basically lets the protesters demonstrate. And that demonstration focused on one particular part of the city where there's a large roundabout, a large traffic circle, where they set up basically a tent city in the roundabout and around the roundabout that served as sort of protest central for several weeks after the sort of the 21st of February into about the 13th of March.
So at this point, were there clearly articulated demands and goals of the protesters?
There were multiple. So like in a lot of these situations, people are not. There's not necessarily one voice that speaks for the protesters. Generally, it was a democratic reform. The demands kind of coalesce more around the block of members of parliament from Shia parties, and they issued demands for a real sort of constitutional monarchy. Bahrain, after protests in the mid-90s, in early 2000, they instituted a parliament, which is, inconsistent with the pure monarchy. But you had kind of this hybrid parliament, which was half elected. The lower house was elected. The upper house was appointed by the king. The opposition wasn't really satisfied as to how that worked out. They felt as though it had betrayed kind of the initial reform. And so the demands they were making really kind of date back to maybe 2006, 2007, when they said, hey, you promised this political reform. Hasn't really happened.
But I think it's worth noting at this point it's not really an existential threat to the regime. They're not saying we want regime change.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like characteristically Bahraini. I mean, the Bahrainis are known in the region as being sort of the most hospitable, friendliest people. And so you sort of saw that play out a little bit, which was the opposition wasn't saying, hey, royal family, you have to step down. I mean, we want an end to the monarchy. We want absolute, one person, one vote rule, absolute, 51% vote, controls the government. They weren't asking for those things. They really were looking at some form of a constitutional monarchy that was stronger even than what had been proposed in the early 2000s. So things like accountability, that the king can appoint ministers and the prime minister, but the parliament can't really hold them accountable. So that was one of the issues: was can the parliament can there be direct election even of a prime minister, if not some form of accountability for the prime minister.
So did those demands evolve? I mean, you got just a couple of minutes before the break. I mean, did it take a turn for more stridency?
So there was a call for national dialogue after the killings that week of February 14th. The Crown Prince, with the support of the king, calls for a national dialogue. The first step was the political opposition saying, you'll have dialogue, but we need a constituent assembly to sort of rewrite a constitution, that was a pretty big change. I mean, that would mean, who knows exactly what that constitution would say. Yes, it would be a constitutional monarchy, but who knows what it would actually look like, and the royal family would have really no control over that if you turned it over to an elected body. There were other demands that were kind of put forward. Ultimately, that what you see happening after this call for dialogue drags on for about a month, hardliners on the Shia side, led by Hassan Mushema, who used to be a member of the political opposition, breaks off and forms a coalition for the Republic. So now they're saying, not even a constitutional monarchy, not even a weak, Britain-style constitutional monarchy. We want an absolute republic, absolute majority rule, which would largely mean, at least in the eyes of the Sunni, Shia rule. It would reverse both the role of the royal family, but also the role of Sunni and Shia in Bahraini society.
So we're reaching a climax and also a break. We'll be right back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking with Rob Ricigliano, who's recently returned from Bahrain. Well, when we last left our story, the demands had gone from sort of reform to basically what the regime would consider sort of unacceptable.
Yeah, I mean, these are true fighting words, not just in a place like, well, to any monarchy, I suppose, but you have to sort of see Bahrain is in the context of these other monarchies. And Bahrain's the smallest of them. Even though you have some small ones in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain is only about 1 million people. So the concern on the part in the region and those other Gulf monarchies is, oh my gosh, if Bahrain, the royal family in Bahrain steps down and you have a republic, right, you pretty much can just, you're just going to ignite the popular passions in those countries for a similar dispensation, and that is seen as an anathema, especially by, say, the people in the government, the family in Saudi Arabia.
Well, which brings us to the sort of next little chapter in the story. Our big brother from across the causeway arrives. What is your sense of how it is the Saudi forces entered Bahrain? Were they invited? Was it an offer the Bahrainis couldn't refuse?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably one of those classic situations where whether they're invited, they may have said, gee, I think it's a good idea if you invite us, and then they get invited, or if they're purely invited, or if they didn't get any invitation. I mean, I don't think, in some ways, the exact mechanism may not matter. I mean, the fact is that you then have it's actually a force put together by the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which has this kind of mutual defense pact, so that if there's a threat in any one of the countries, the other countries have a pre-existing license to intervene and restore stability. So,
how provocative was that seen by the protesters?
Well, it was interesting in that the protests up to that point, up till in the middle of March 10th or so, was pretty peaceful. I mean, if you went to the roundabout, it wasn't a lighthearted atmosphere, but it definitely was a safe, almost friendly atmosphere, and that you could walk around. Even representatives of the government could walk around, talk to people in the various tents, and people were very polite and hospitable. But clearly making a point. I mean, they obviously had demands, and they were voicing those demands and complaints. What happened before the GCC and the Saudi forces came in was the protests began moving, and it was really at the instigation of this hardline element, the al-Haq element that had called for the republic. The most provocative act was to cut off access to the financial harbor, which is the financial district in Bahrain, which is really the financial, almost lifeblood of the country. I mean,
there's like taking over Wall Street.
Yeah, exactly. And they set up roadblocks. The protesters set up roadblocks. A brigadier general in the police went to negotiate with them to try to get them removed. He's attacked and beaten in the head, as severe brain trauma, taken to the intensive care unit. At that point, it was both the protesters really for the first time got aggressive. I mean, another policeman was run down by a car. Others were stabbed. Plus the threatening the financial sort of lifeblood, I think began to be too much for the Saudis, I'm guessing.
Well, at that point, do you think it was a case of just it's spinning out of control of whatever leadership there was among the protesters, or was it more of a concerted effort?
It's a good question, and I think one to kind of keep watching and try to figure this out, because you have factions both in the protesters and in the royal family. So you had the negotiation wing that said the Bahraini way is to sit down and work this out. Sunni Shia have coexisted here for many, many years. We can do it now. We will show the world that there is a third path, not instant fall of a government nor violent suppression, but a cooperative path, right? That begins to now get challenged, and you had the Saudis in particular saying, this is getting a little unnerving for us. The path here is to clamp down. The Saudis just previous to this had their own. They were scheduled a day of rage in Saudi Arabia, which was sort of very swiftly sort of preempted and put down by the Saudi government. You had very little protest, and I'm thinking the Saudis are saying to the Bahrainis, you gotta clamp down on this. We don't like where this is going, which I think emboldened the non-negotiation part of the royal family, and the combination of that plus the Saudi influence, the GCC influence, I think led the government to pull back from the negotiation process. Plus, the process now had been kind of in abeyance for almost a month, where the government had called for a dialogue. The opposition was talking about it, but wasn't ever committing to it. And I think that there was just the balance tipped at that point, middle of March, and then the Saudi forces come in, and then the crackdown begins.
And we want to get to some of the larger regional context, but where are we now in terms of what's going on in the street? So
the situation was in some ways pacified or normalized, and normal I really got to put in quotes, in really a matter of days. I mean, the protesters were cleared out of the roundabout and off the streets. There are military checkpoints around the capital city. But movement begins within a week or so. Movement begins to return to the capital life isn't quite normal, but nor is there tension and provocation in this. The crackdown was severe in many ways. People did lose their lives, but compared to, say, what happened in Yemen or even Syria, it was much less violent than those. So it is in this kind of uneasy state of, is this the new normal? What happens next? How long are these forces going to stay there? When will the government get back onto the table? There was an effort or an offer by the Kuwaitis to mediate that was accepted by the opposition, but refused by the government, which seems to be less than willing at this point to kind of return to the negotiation table.
And what is the U.S. stake in all of this?
Well, I mean, the U.S. has the Fifth Fleet also in Bahrain, based in Bahrain, which means the ability of the U.S. to project power in the Persian Gulf, vital supply line for the world's oil as well as other things, is centered there on Bahrain. And so the U.S. has a security interest there. It has obviously an interest in the democratic sort of transitions that are happening throughout the Arab world. They've come under criticism. The Obama administration has come under criticism for intervening against Muammar Gaddafi, calling for the ouster of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, but not really taking a very strong stand against the Bahraini government sort of moving in with force. So it's politically causing problems, I think, for the United States.
What was your sense of just the average Bahraini's perception of the U.S. presence there? I mean, are we likely to see Obama burned in effigy in the streets?
Generally, the U.S. is held in fairly good regard by both Sunni and Shia in Bahrain. I think there was some disappointment on the part of many Shia that the U.S. was not taking a stronger position in support of democratic change, nor was the United States taking the position that there should not be democratic change. So there was at least, a neutral, if not slightly positive view toward the United States among most Bahrainis. I think that may change, though, depending on how this sort of plays out. I think if the U.S. does not come back to and say, hey, there needs to be dialogue, as was originally proposed, I think that may change some minds.
Well, the huge elephant in the room, of course, is Iran, and Ali Salman, who's an opposition leader, had a quote in the press recently. He said, "We don't want Bahrain to turn into a conflict zone between Saudi Arabia and Iran." To what extent is that a driver of this?
It has turned into a conflict zone between Saudi Arabia and Iran, very much. I mean, the as I mentioned before, that with Iran has already asserted territorial claim to Bahrain. There was the Sunni government claimed to have uncovered a plot after the revolution in Iran to overthrow the government, the Sunni government in Bahrain as well. So there is fear that Iran has designs on Bahrain. Certainly, Saudi Arabia does not want an Iranian satellite on its doorstep. A mere 16 miles away. And whether that comes through, it probably would not come through sort of forcible presence of Iran in Bahrain, but it's when people in Saudi say here, a republic in Bahrain, they're thinking Bahrain becoming a close ally of Iran, and that very much scares them.
One sort of easy and I think probably too simplistic analysis we often see in this country is Shia equals pro-Iran, and that certainly wasn't the case in much of Iraq, for example. Right. Do you get that sense?
There are two main mullahs, Shia mullahs in Bahrain, who are really respected by most of the Shia population. One of which is maybe closer to the Ayatollahs in Iran, and the other of which answers more or is more in line with Ayatollah Ali Sistani in Iraq. So it's not clear that Iran, the religious leadership in Bahrain is beholden to the religious leadership in Iran. There's also, though, I think, a feeling amongst most Shia Bahrainis that they are Bahraini. They are not Iranian. There is some significant sort of Persian population in Bahrain, but it's also a largely Arab population, Sunni and Shia. So, just to complicate things further, you have a Persian Arab mix in there as well as the Sunni Shia mix, and they're not perfectly aligned. Not all. There are Persians who are Sunni as well as Shia, and Arabs who are both Sunni and Shia.
So we got about a minute left. What's the U.S. role going forward?
I think the U.S. interest has been to push the dialogue track. That in the long run, this has to go that direction because of all these things we've talked about. The military issues, the United States, U.S. needs stability there. The Sunni Shia issue and its implications throughout the region. The oil-producing part of Saudi Arabia is predominantly Shia, even though Saudi is predominantly Sunni. So for lots of reasons, the U.S. needs stability there. They need a democratic win, but they can't afford a destabilizing outcome that would threaten the U.S. base and threaten stability in the greater Gulf region.
Well, we'll have to keep an eye on what could potentially be the calm before the storm. And I'll see you around the water cooler. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.